You stop believing in yourself. And the really funny thing is that you think I'm going to tell you that's a tragedy. I'm not. You stop believing in yourself the moment someone more important than you decided you should. Maybe it was a boardroom. Maybe it was a bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning after a career you spent 20 years building quietly folded itself into a drawer and stopped returning your calls. Maybe it was subtler than that, a slow drain. A series of rooms where your opinions echoed differently than they used to. Where the person you used to be seemed to require a password you'd misplaced sometime around your 43rd birthday. And now here you are, watching a video about confidence. Let me ask you something. What did you think confidence was exactly? Because I have a very specific, very accurate feeling that somewhere in the architecture of your belief, confidence looked like approval. Like permission, like a form someone official had stamped and handed back to you, which made it real, made you legitimate, made you allowed. You've been waiting for that stamp your entire adult life, haven't you? I know a man, very serious, very decorated, who once rebuilt an entire identity after the thing he was most certain about turned out to be the very thing that broke him. Lost it all, professionally, quietly. The kind of loss that doesn't make headlines because the headlines were never about him to begin with, only about what he produced. He told me later he spent 3 years being invisible before he understood that invisibility isn't the same as disappearing. You can choose to be unseen, but you can't choose to not exist. That's where we begin. Not at the bottom. At the moment just after the bottom, when you're standing in the rubble and the rubble is completely, perfectly silent. The monster method isn't about rebuilding who you were. It never was. You know what I've noticed? No. Actually, let me put it differently. I've spent a considerable amount of time watching people lose things. Jobs, marriages, businesses, reputations, the particular way they used to walk into a room. And the loss itself is almost never the most interesting part. The interesting part, the part that tells you everything, is what they do in the 6 months after. Because in those 6 months, a person reveals whether they were ever actually themselves, or whether they were simply performing a version of themselves that the world had agreed to applaud. 40 is the audition you didn't know you were in. Here is what happened to you, specifically. You had a framework, structure, career, position, identity. They all held hands in a particular formation, and as long as that formation held, you knew what you were. Not who. What? The title. The trajectory. The reliable morning version of yourself that other people could predict. That version was comfortable. Functional. Well reviewed. And then something broke the formation. And the question you've been sitting with ever since, the one you don't say out loud because saying it out loud would require kind of honesty that costs more than you've been willing to spend, is, if none of that was actually me, then what exactly is left? You lie in bed, and the thoughts come in this order. I used to be good at things. No. You tell yourself, no, I am still good at things. I just haven't had the chance to prove it. But then the quieter thought, the one underneath. What if I'm not anymore? What if that version of me was a phase, and the phase is simply over? And then the most dangerous thought of all, what if everyone else already knows this, and they're just waiting for me to figure it out? That last one. That's the one running your life right now. I want you to look at that thought carefully. Really look at it. Because what it's describing isn't actually a fear of failure. It's a fear of being seen failing. It's the fear of the audience, of the specific, imagined reaction of people who, in most cases, are far too absorbed in their own quiet disasters to be watching yours with anything approaching attention. You have constructed an entire theater of judgment in your head. The seats are full, the critics are prepared, and you have concluded before the curtain even rises that the show isn't worth staging. I once knew a man, deeply committed to doing the right thing, endlessly disciplined, never once wavered from his code, who had this remarkable habit of appearing only when the situation had already been defined for him. Someone else always named the problem first. He showed up to solve it immaculately, and then retreated back to his certainty before anyone could ask who he was when nothing needed solving. A very efficient system, really. For a man who had no idea what he actually wanted from his own life. He called it purpose. I thought it looked more like performance with better lighting. But you're not performing anymore. And that's why it hurts. Because the performance had rules. The performance had metrics. A promoter, an audience, a clear measure of success. And when it stopped, you weren't left with nothing. You were left with yourself. Raw, unscripted, without the costume of competence that the career had been providing free of charge every single morning for 2 decades. And yourself turns out to be strange. Uncertain. Bigger in some places than you expected, and frighteningly small in others. So here is the real question. Not how do I rebuild my confidence? That's the question you came here with. That's the surface question. The Joker's question. The one that lives you. Underneath that one, crouching is this. What would you do? And who would you become if you stopped needing anyone's permission to exist fully? Hold that. Don't answer it yet, because the answer changes everything. You don't have a confidence problem. You have a definition problem. Confidence, as the world has sold it to you, is an emotion, a feeling of readiness, a warm internal signal that arrives before you attempt something difficult and says, yes, proceed, you're cleared for takeoff. That version of confidence is fiction. I don't mean it's rare. I mean it does not exist. The people you have spent your life identifying as confident, the ones in the rooms who spoke first, who held eye contact a second longer than was comfortable, who seemed to arrive having already decided they belonged. Most of them were not feeling readiness. They were performing it. And the performance was so practiced it looked like nature. Confidence is not a state. It is a decision. It's the decision to act before the certainty arrives. The certainty never arrives first. The certainty is always downstream, always built by action, never the precondition for it. You have been standing at the edge of your own potential, waiting for a feeling that was always supposed to come after, not before. What you actually have is not a lack of confidence. You have a mismatch between who you were trained to be and who you actually are. And that mismatch at 40-something becomes impossible to ignore because the anesthetic of a busy career is no longer running. The label is wrong. That's the beginning. When the label is wrong, you stop treating the wrong problem. Where did this start? Not the career collapse. Before that, you were trained from an age when you had no vocabulary to object to the training that your worth lived outside your body. In grades, in approval, in the measured response of the F. Aces around you when you did something. Your parents, your teachers, your first employers, none of them were cruel, necessarily. Most of them were simply passing down the only system they've been given. The system that says, perform well, be rewarded with belonging. perform poorly, and the belonging becomes conditional. And so you learned incredibly well. You became excellent at performing. You got so good at it that performance stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like identity. The role became the self. Until the role ended, and then there was nothing in the drawer where the self was supposed to be. What happened to your confidence after 40 isn't a failure of character. It is the entirely predictable outcome of a system that told you your value was a product you manufactured for other people's consumption. And then the market closed. The real origin isn't weakness. It's misaddiction. And misdedication can be corrected, but only after you've stopped blaming yourself for the diagnosis someone else wrote on your chart. The people who judge your visible loss of confidence, let's look at them for a moment, just briefly. With the lights up, what is it that judgment reveals about the judge? When someone looks at you, navigating this particular wilderness with honesty instead of performance, and decides that makes you lesser, what is that actually telling you? It's telling you they're afraid. Specifically afraid of the wilderness you're currently standing in, because they haven't survived it yet and suspect, very quietly, in the part of themselves they don't invite to dinner parties, that they might not. Your visible uncertainty reminds them of their invisible uncertainty. Your refusal to perform invulnerability makes them furious, because they have been performing it for years, and the cost is something they dare not calculate. I used to watch a man, Tremin, dashly committed, wonderfully rigid about the rules he'd set for himself, judge everyone around him by how close they came to his particular standard of discipline. He never said it, of course. He was far too principled to say it, but you could see it in the jaw. In a precise way, he turned away from anyone who was messy in the ways he feared being messy himself. He thought that distance was discernment. I thought it was the longest ongoing audit of his own terror I'd ever had. The pleasure of witnessing the people who judge your struggle are not your measurement. They are your evidence that the cage was real, that others are still in it, and that you are, however uncomfortably, on the outside of it. Here is something no one will say to you at 40, standing in the wreckage of something that used to feel solid. You know more than you have ever known, and for the first time, what you know has been paid for in full. The person who has not failed catastrophically has knowledge that is theoretical, clean, academic. They know what the books say. You know what actually happens when the books are wrong. That is not a deficit. That is an asset of such specificity and value that it cannot be manufactured by any institution, purchased with any degree, or mimicked by anyone who hasn't paid the price. The setback at 40 didn't take your competence. It stripped away the scaffolding that was hiding your actual competence from yourself. The raw, undecorated, honest version of what you can do. That version is still standing. It was always the most durable part of you. You simply couldn't see it when it was covered in titles and organizational charts and the comfortable noise of a functioning career. When this trait, this particular kind of hard-won knowing, is not suppressed or apologized for, it becomes the most decisive advantage in the room. The quiet force of someone has already survived the worst version of what everyone else is afraid of. That is not a wound. That is a weapon. And the difference between a wound and a weapon is simply which way you decide to hold it. There is a version of this experience that destroys a person. I've seen it. The man who loses something significant at 45 and turns that loss into a permanent verdict on his value. He carries it forward like an announcement. Something broken lives here, and uses it to preemptively disqualify himself from anything that requires the risk of failing again. He mistakes survived pain for proof of future limitation. That is confidence in collapse. That is the knife dropped, blade up, on the floor. And then there is the other version. The man who loses something significant at 45 and decides, not dramatically, not in a speech, just quietly, in the private interior of his own thinking, that the loss is data and not destiny. He picks up the knife differently, not in a fist, not in panic, with intention, with the deliberate grip of someone who knows what the blade actually does and has decided to be specific about what he's cutting away. The monster method is not about becoming harder. It's not about building a wall around the soft parts so nothing can reach them again. A wall is a confession. A wall says, I am afraid of what will happen if I am known. The monster method is about becoming more fully, more precisely, more dangerously yourself than you were before the loss. Because the loss removed the performance, and what's left, if you're honest, is actually far more interesting. Confidence rebuilt from surviving is not the same substance as confidence that was never tested. Not remotely. One of them is decoration. The other is architecture. The language you use inside your own skull is either building the monster or sedating it. And right now, I suspect you're sedating it daily with a very particular vocabulary. Words like used to, too old, behind, too late. These are not descriptions. They are verdicts you hand down and then agree to enforce. And they are wrong. Not wrong in the soft, reassuring sense. Wrong in the precise, measurable, demonstrably incorrect sense. Replace I used to be good at this with I'm learning who I am now. That the performance is over. Replace I'm too far behind with I'm operating without the map, which means I'm navigating by actual terrain. Replace too late, and this one is important, with expensive. Everything that happened to you was expensive. That doesn't mean the budget is gone. It means you paid for something real. The internal language does not need to be positive. The Joker is not asking you to be positive. The Joker is not asking you to become an optimist. I'm asking you to become accurate because the catastrophizing, the unfinished, I'm done, the world has moved on without me, is not realism. It is a very elaborate defense mechanism dressed up as clearer-eyed thinking. If you fail before you try, you never have to feel the specific humiliation of trying and failing in front of someone. And that deal, that quiet private deal, is costing you everything. Say it differently. Say it accurately. And then, critically, say something small, do something small, and watch the language find its own new words in the space that action creates. Not every room you currently occupy was built for the person you are becoming. Some of them, and I want you to think carefully about which ones, were constructed specifically to remind you of the person you were in ways that are not useful to you, delivered by people who have a vested interest in you remaining comprehensible to them. The colleague who brings up your former role at every opportunity, not to celebrate it, but to anchor you to it. The family dinner conversation that treats your current period of reinvention as an extended bout of confusion that will presumably resolve back to the familiar. The social circles that defined you by your title and now find the definition without the title slightly uncomfortable. These environments are not neutral. They are active. They are pulling in a direction, and the direction is backward. You do not need to burn these runes down. You simply need to stop treating them as the rooms where the verdict on your value gets reached. Some people in your life were there for the performance. Now that the performance is on hiatus, they don't know where to look. That's their limitation, not yours. Stop adjusting your self-conception to fit within the frame of what makes them comfortable, and seek deliberately, intentionally, as an act of self-preservation, the rooms where what you've survived is a credential rather than an embarrassment. They exist. The people inside them are not waiting for the version of you that had it all together. They are waiting for the version that knows what breaking actually feels like from the inside. That version has far more to offer than the polished one ever did. The next time someone directly, or through the specific eloquence of their silence, implies that you are less than you were, that your current position is a reflection of your permanent capacity, that the loss is the final word, here is what you say, internally, to yourself. 2 sentences. They are describing what they fear, not what I am. And I have already survived the thing they are afraid of, which means we are not the same. Do not say this out loud. Do not argue. Do not defend. The defense is always weaker than the certainty underneath it. Let the certainty sit exactly where it is. Private, immovable, not interested in being witnessed by people who wouldn't understand it. Anyway, certainty that needs an audience isn't certainty. It's still approval-seeking in a more aggressive outfit. The response protocol is not silence born from defeat. It is silence born from the knowledge that some battles are beneath the weight of your attention. This is not a declaration you make to anyone else. It is a decision made once, quietly, and then maintained, not with effort, but with refusal. The refusal to negotiate it. The ownership statement is this: I am not a diminished version of who I was. I am a more concentrated version of what I actually am. The loss burned away the decorative. What's left is structural. And I'm done apologizing for the structural. No drama, no announcement, no crowd to witness the decision. You make it the way you make any irreversible choice. In the private interior where it actually lives. And then you let the decision govern the behavior, rather than waiting for the feeling to give you permission. The ownership statement is not pride. Pride is fragile and comparative. It needs someone lesser nearby to confirm it. The ownership statement is posture. The physical and mental posture of a person who has decided simply that they are worth the space they take up. Not more than others. Not less. Exactly as much. Small victories confirm the decision every day. Not grand ones. Not the career resurrected overnight. You solve one small problem. You do one thing you said you would do. You show up on time to the version of your life that is happening right now. Not the one you're mourning. Not the one you're waiting for. This one. And the monster. The real monster. The real monster. The version of you that doesn't require permission. Grows one day at a time, fed by action, not by feelings about action. That is the method. Daily, incremental, undramatic, devastatingly effective. The world was not built to accommodate what you become after surviving something serious. That needs to be said plainly without softening it into something palatable. The standard, the template, the recommended art of a productive life. End somewhere around 40 with you, either having arrived at a recognizable destination or being quietly reclassified as a cautionary note. The system does not have a category for the person who was broken in the middle and chose, on the other side of the breaking, to be something entirely different and more honest. You were not supposed to become more interesting after the disaster. You were supposed to become smaller, chastened, appropriately diminished, more careful, less certain of things, more deferential to the structures that outlasted your ambitions. That is what the system requires. People who, after failing, understand their role more modestly. You refusing to do that, you choosing instead to excavate the wreckage for something truer than what was there before, is not recovery in a conventional sense. It is more interesting than recovery. It is the act of someone who has looked at the approved blueprint for a life and decided, with full information and at significant personal cost, that they are not interested in the approved blueprint anymore. That is not bravery as it gets performed on stages. It is the quiet, relentless, unflattering version. The kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside. The kind that happens in ordinary rooms on ordinary days where no one is watching, and the decision gets made again and again. I am not finished. Not by this. Not by any version of this. Here is what is actually true about you right now. Not what you fear is true. Not what the collapse implied about you. What is actually true. You are the most honest version of yourself you have ever been, because the performance is over and you don't have the energy or the inclination to rebuild it in the same shape. You are running for the first time in decades on your actual reserves, not on the institutional energy of a role that provided you with a ready-made reason to get up in the morning. You are operating with real information about your own limits and real information about your own depths, which is something no amount of success, uninterrupted, could have purchased. And the confidence you rebuild from here, if you build it correctly, if you build it the monster method way, one quiet daily victory at a time will not look like the confidence you had before. It will not be mistakable for the performed variety. It will not need a rune's acknowledgement to remain standing. It will simply be there, immovable, unremarkable. The way of foundation is unremarkable. Underground, invisible, load-bearing. You already know something most people your age were never supposed to learn. Not because someone taught it to you, because someone took something from you, or many things, over many years, and left you standing there with nothing but the weight of the lesson and the silence that follows a loss no one else saw coming. And somewhere in that silence, something changed, something hardened. Not in the brittle way glass hardens, in the way iron does, through fire, through pressure, through the very specific cruelty of time. They call it getting older. They mean it as a consolation. A participation trophy for surviving decades. Oh, look at you, still standing. How quaint, how resilient. But here's what they won't say. What the motivational posters can't say, because the truth doesn't sell supplements or seminars. The people who have lived past 40 have something the young and the eager and the endlessly optimistic simply do not possess. Not wisdom exactly. Wisdom is just information dressed up in a robe. I mean, something more dangerous than that. I mean, scar tissue. And scar tissue, you see, doesn't feel the way open wounds do. It doesn't bleed when you press on it. It doesn't flinch. It just sits there, thicker than the skin around it. Harder, more permanent, proof that you were broken and the world didn't get to keep you that way. The young ones see the gray in your hair and the quiet in your eyes, and they call it defeat. They call it settling. They post their sunrise runs and their productivity stacks and their 10-year plans, and they genuinely believe they are ahead of you. Let them. You've been in rooms they haven't entered yet. You've paid tabs they don't even know exist. The question isn't whether your years have changed you. Of course they have. The question The only one that actually matters is whether you've figured out yet what those changes are actually worth. You haven't. Not fully. But you're about to. Let's start where it started. Not at 40. Not at 35 when you first noticed the math wasn't adding up. Let's go back further. To the first time someone told you to be realistic. You know exactly which memory just surfaced. Don't pretend you don't. Maybe it was a teacher. Maybe a parent. Maybe it was the first time you tried something enormous. Something electric, something that had your whole chest in it. And someone you respected looked at you with that very specific expression. Not cruelty. Something worse. Practicality. The face of a person who had once wanted what you wanted and decided the wanting was the problem, and something in you listened. That's what no one talks about. Not the people who stopped you, but that you listened. That some younger, softer version of you heard the word realistic and started slowly, methodically, dismantling the parts of yourself that made other people uncomfortable. You got practical. You got reasonable. You got, and this is the word they like, stable. You traded the bright, terrifying version of your own life for something that fit in a resume and made sense at dinner parties. And for a while, maybe a long while, you convinced yourself this was maturity, that the burning thing you'd set aside was just immaturity, just youth, just a phase. Then something happened. A number of things happened. A marriage that corroded slowly instead of breaking cleanly. A career that delivered exactly what it promised and nothing it didn't. A moment at 42, or 46, or 51, standing somewhere entirely ordinary, your kitchen, your car, a Wednesday afternoon, and the thought arrived without invitation. Is this it? Not dramatically. That's what makes it devastating. There was no music, no epiphany, just a quiet, flat, perfectly calibrated question. Is this it? And instead of answering it, because the answer frightened you, you got busier. You optimized. You found new metrics for the life you already had. You convinced yourself that the discomfort was something to be managed, not heard. Meanwhile, the people younger than you were failing, loudly, posting failures, monetizing failures, wearing their implosions like badges while you had spent decades swallowing yours in private. Swallowing yours in private. Reshaping your face in the mirror until it looked like a person who was fine. Here's what I find interesting about that. You learn through pure repeated exposure to consequence how to survive something without collapsing. You learned it the hard way, the only way it actually gets learned, and then you looked at all that accumulated endurance and called it nothing. Called it ordinary. Called it just your life. Someone I used to spend a great deal of time around had a similar habit. Very committed individual. Very thorough. Who had absorbed an almost theatrical of and pain on behalf of others, and had become so practiced at absorbing it in silence that he genuinely could not tell the difference anymore between strength and suppression. He had mistaken the ability to endure for a personality. I found that both impressive and deeply, deeply funny. But you built something from it. You just haven't named it yet. The real pain point isn't the failure. It's not the disappointment, the delay, the decades of course correcting. The real wound is the refusal to recognize that the person who got through all of that is meaningfully, measurably, irreversibly different from who they would have been without it. You are standing on the other side of 1,000 small catastrophes, and you are still describing yourself in the angle. Age of someone who hasn't survived anything yet? You still apologize for being tired? You still edit your opinions before you speak? You still measure yourself against 25-year-olds who are still running on the confidence of people who haven't been truly tested yet. And the question underneath all of that, the one you've been avoiding since you started watching this, is simple. When are you going to stop explaining yourself to people who haven't earned the right to understand you? Jaded. That's their word for you, isn't it? That's their word for you, isn't it? The generous ones say experienced. The less generous ones say bitter. The ones who've never lost anything say resistant to change. None of these are the correct word. Jaded means deadened. Jaded means the nerve endings stopped firing and the lights went out behind the eyes. What you have is the opposite of that. What you have is calibrated. A machine that has been tested in the field, broken, repaired, modified, not in a factory, by someone who read the manual, but in the actual terrain, under actual pressure, with actual consequences. You are not dulled. You are precise. The label jaded is applied by people who want the world to retain its power, to manipulate them. They need to believe that hope is infinite and stakes are low. And every new thing deserves the same bright-eyed rush. Because if experience teaches you something, if it meaningfully changes your responses, then it means they might also one day be changed. And that terrifies them more than almost anything. You are not jaded. You are accurate. And accuracy feels cold to people still running on illusion. Here's the thing about resilience that nobody says clearly enough. It does not come from good experiences. It cannot. Good experiences give you confidence, and confidence is useful, but confidence is breakable. Confidence depends on continued success. Resilience, the actual thing, the structural thing, comes from surviving the experiences you are certain you would not survive. You did not choose this. Let's be honest about that. Nobody auditions for heartbreak. Nobody volunteers for financial ruin or medical terror or the slow erasure of a life they thought they understood. You did not build your resilience on purpose. But the brain, your brain, the one that has now recorded several decades of outcomes, it has done something remarkable without your permission. It has developed a library, not of facts, of probabilities. Every time you face something enormous and came out the other side, your nervous system updated its threat assessment. You have a physiological, measurable, neurological advantage over anyone who hasn't accumulated what you've accumulated. And that advantage doesn't live in your memories. It lives in your reflexes. The young have speed. You have depth. And in any encounter that actually matters, in any conversation, any crisis, any moment that requires more than surface response, depth wins. Let's look at the ones doing the judging, because this is always instructive. The people who look at your age and see a limitation or to a person operating from one of two places. Either they are young enough to still believe that the world is a meritocracy that rewards enthusiasm and punishes experience, in which case they're wrong and time will correct them without any intervention from you. Or they are people who are afraid that what happened to you will happen to them. And so they need your experience to be a failure rather than a transformation, because the alternative is that they too might one day be tested. Either way, neither of these is a problem you are obligated to solve. I once watched a very principled man, someone with a remarkable commitment to his own moral framework, spend enormous energy judging for the messiness of their lives, never broken a rule, never deviated from the structure he'd built. He called it integrity. I called it the fear of a man who had never been forced to find out what he was actually made of. He was protecting a self-image that had never been stress-tested, the most brittle thing in any room, is the thing that's never been bent, and he was architecturally a disaster awaiting for the right kind of pressure. Their judgment is not about you. Their judgment is about the thing they're afraid of becoming, and you already became it and survived. And that is unbearable to people who are still hoping to avoid it. Let's be specific, not metaphorical. Sapisic. People over 40, sapisic. People over 40 who have genuinely engaged with the hardship their lives delivered possess identifiable functional advantages. They do not need external validation to maintain their position. Not because they don't feel the pull, they do, but because they have learned through repeated exposure that external validation is the most unreliable currency in existence. It arrives late, leaves early, and was never actually about you. They are better at distinguishing signal from noise. The young consume everything with equal intensity. Every opinion, every criticism, every piece of encouragement registers at roughly the same volume. People who have been around for a while have developed filtering systems. They know which voices to track and which to let pass. They have a relationship with time that the young cannot access. The young have urgency. The experienced have perspective. And perspective, it turns out, is what allows you to play a long game in a culture that is entirely organized around the short one. They can tolerate ambiguity without collapsing. This is perhaps the most underrated advantage of all. The ability to sit in the middle of an unresolved situation, a relationship, a P that hasn't clarified, a project that hasn't included, a feeling that hasn't named itself, without forcing a premature resolution. This is a skill built entirely by surviving situations that didn't resolve neatly. Your advantage is not your experience. Your advantage is your nervous system's response to experience. You have been permanently reconfigured by what you've been through, and that reconfiguration is irreversible. There is a version of all this that becomes its own trap, worth naming it precisely. The hardship as identity trap, when the suffering becomes the story, and the story becomes the only available narrative, and you start using your history as an excuse rather than a context. You've seen it in others. The person who survived something terrible and decided that the surviving was the whole of who they are. So any growth past the wound would feel like a betrayal of the wound. This is the knife held in panic. Gripping the past so tightly it draws your own blood. Not because it protects you, but because releasing it would require deciding who you are. Without it, the knife held with intent looks different. It knows what happened. It carries the weight of what happened without advertising it in every conversation. It uses the clarity that hardship provides, the ability to see clearly, to assess accurately, to prioritize ruthlessly in the service of what comes next. Not in the service of never being hurt again. In the service of something that actually matters. You are not your losses. You are what you built in the rubble where your losses landed. And the question is not whether the rubble shaped you. Of course it did. The question is whether you're building with it or living in it. There is a meaningful, permanent difference between a person whose difficulties gave them depth and a person whose difficulties gave them an excuse. You know which one you've been. The interesting question is, which one you're choosing to be right now. The Joker does not give advice. He gives you posture shifts. Stop using the word still, as in, I'm still figuring things out. I'm still figuring things out. I'm still trying to understand. The word still transforms every ongoing process into an apology. It positions you in permanent incompletion, as though the standard you're being measured against is the finished version of some ideal person who solved everything ahead of schedule. The replacement is not some aggressive self-affirmation. It's simpler than that. It's declarative instead of. I'm still trying to find my direction. Try. I'm moving. Instead of, I still haven't gotten over it. Try. I'm accounting for it. Instead of, I feel like I'm behind. Try. I'm exactly where 4 decades of actual living would place a person. Language is not decoration. It is architecture, the internal words you use. Construct the internal house you live in. If every sentence you say about yourself contains an apology for being in process, for being human, for being nonlinear, for being someone who has been genuinely tested, you are building a house with a structural weakness at the foundation. And no amount of motivational content rearranges the furniture into something load-bearing. Replace the apology words methodically. Every time you hear yourself diminishing the fact of your own duration on Earth. Certain rooms were designed to make your experience feel like a deficit. Some of those rooms are physical. Workplaces built around the speed and flexibility of people 20 years younger. Social environments organized around performance and aspiration and the breathless forward momentum of people who haven't slowed down enough to question what they're running toward. Some of those rooms are relational. People who knew you before you became who you are, who are invested, deeply, structurally invested, and you remain legible to the version of you they first cataloged, not out of malice, but because your change threatens their map. Some of those rooms are internal. The conversations you have with yourself that were written by someone else's expectations and have been running unquestioned ever since. The audit is simple. For each room you regularly occupy, physical, relational, internal, ask one question. Does this room require me to become smaller to exist in it comfortably? If yes, that is useful information. You do not necessarily need to leave every room that makes you smaller, but you need to know you are making yourself smaller to be in it. Unconscious diminishment is the danger. Conscious choice is something else entirely. You are allowed to choose your battles. You are not allowed to pretend the war isn't happening. The next time someone looks at your age, your experience, your history, your accumulated years of navigating things they haven't encountered yet, and frames it as a limitation, you need 2 internal sentences, not said aloud, just carried. First sentence, you don't have the reference points for this conversation yet. Second sentence, that's not my problem to solve in the next 30 seconds. That's it. Not defensive. Not explanatory. Not an invitation to justify yourself to someone who has not done the reading required to question you meaningfully. Just those 2 sentences. They function as a circuit breaker. They interrupt the reflexive shrinking, the reflexive explaining, the reflexive performance of humility that costs you something every single time. You are not obligated to be legible to people who haven't earned the context to understand you. That is not arrogance. That is simple mathematics. This is not a mantra. It's a decision. Mantras are things you repeat until you believe them. This is something you either decide or don't. The decision is this. The version of yourself that was forged by everything you have survived is the real one, not the pre-difficulty version. Not the hypothetical version of you who had better luck and easier weather. The one standing here with exactly this history. With exactly this history. Exactly this collection of losses and recalibrations and unexpected survivals. This is the primary version. Not the backup. Not the compromise. Not the result of things going wrong. The result of things going real. You don't perform this. You don't announce it. You just stop apologizing for it. Stop contextualizing your experience with qualifiers that frame it as a detour from some more legitimate path. Stop introducing yourself as someone who got delayed, derailed, damaged. The mental posture of someone who has genuinely stopped apologizing for who they are is not pride. Pride is loud, and it needs an audience. This is quieter than that. It's the posture of a person who has simply removed, but I'm sorry for the inconvenience, from the end of their own story. You were shaped by your life. That's not a failure of planning. That's how people get built. There is a system. It wasn't built for you, not for who you actually are. The complicated, weathered, precisely calibrated version of you that exists after everything you've been through. It was built for a certain kind of productivity, a certain kind of legibility, a certain kind of legibility, a model of human value that is organized around velocity and novelty and the specific kind of confidence that requires no history because it hasn't accumulated one yet. The system prefers the early chapters. It rewards the beginning of things, the launch, the debut, the first impression. It is structurally uncomfortable with the middle chapters, with the hard years, with the long, unglamorous stretch where most of the actual building happens and nobody is watching, and the results are not yet visible, and the only thing keeping you moving is the specific stubbornness of someone who has already lost enough to know that stopping is not actually safer than continuing. The system doesn't know what to do with you. Here's what is actually true about you right now. You are holding more capacity than the framing around you is designed to contain. The emotional range, the tolerance for complexity, the ability to hold contradictions without flinching, the knowledge, bone deep, proof-tested knowledge that the thing you feared did not kill you, and neither will the next thing, and neither will the thing after that. That's not nothing. That's not a consolation prize for aging. That is a functional, transferable, irreplaceable advantage in every domain that actually matters. In relationships, in creative work, in decisions. In the capacity to be genuinely present with another person in their worst moments without disappearing into performance or panic. The young will run bright and fast and loud, and some of them will find a way to what you already carry. And when they do, they will look back at the years it took them and understand, finally, clearly, without the comforting illusion that suffering was optional. What you've known for a while is that the cost was the curriculum. You did not waste those years. You were not set back by what happened to you. You were set apart by it. The question was never whether you could survive what life delivered. You answered that already with your continued presence in it. The question, the only one still worth asking. The question, the only one still worth asking, is whether you're going to spend the remaining decades shrinking yourself to fit the rooms that weren't built for you, or whether you're going to stop asking for permission from people who cannot see what you've become. The answer doesn't need to be said out loud. It just needs to be decided. And unlike the younger version of you, the one still waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right amount of certainty before moving. You know that the decision doesn't require perfect conditions. You've made decisions in the dark, in the wreckage, with nothing but the knowledge that forward was still forward. You already know how to do this. You've been doing it your whole life. That's the advantage. That was always the advantage. They stopped watching you. You noticed it somewhere around the time the birthday cards got fewer. The promotions went to someone with a fresher face, and the table stopped going quiet when you walked in. You noticed it, and here's what I find exquisitely funny. You decided that was a problem. You started adjusting, trimming, shrinking yourself down to fit a space that was never designed for who you actually are anymore. You started performing urgency, relevance, youth for an audience that had already walked out of the theater. Let me ask you something. When a lion sits very still in tall grass, when it has stopped announcing itself, stopped making noise, stopped explaining what it is to the gazelles grazing nearby, do you think that lion is losing? Do you think the quiet is weakness? No. Of course not. You know what the quiet is, but you forgot that you're the lion. Somewhere between 40 and now, someone convinced you that invisibility was failure. That being overlooked was the same as being irrelevant. That the room not noticing you when you walked in meant something had gone wrong with you. Nothing went wrong. Something went right. Something finally, quietly, brilliantly, right? And you've been so busy apologizing for it that you haven't stopped to recognize what it is. The world just handed you the rarest weapon a person can carry. A weapon so subtle that most people never realize they're holding it. And you've been trying to give it back. I'm going to show you what it is. And then, this is the part that's going to sting slightly. I'm going to show you how long you've been using it against yourself. It started earlier than 40. Let's be precise about this. It started the first time you did something genuinely remarkable, and the room didn't react the way you expected. Maybe you were 12. Maybe 22. Maybe 35. The exact age doesn't matter. What matters is the conclusion you drew from the silence. The conclusion was, not enough. You were not enough. And so, methodically, with the diligence of someone who actually cares about doing things correctly, you began optimizing. You optimized your presentation. You learned to enter rooms louder, to speak with more certainty than you felt, to dress for the version of yourself that other people found easiest to digest. You studied what got attention. You practiced giving people exactly the signal they were looking for, because the alternative, the real you, operating on your own frequency, seemed to produce confusion, indifference, sometimes mild irritation. And it worked. For a while it worked. But then you turned 40, or 42, or 47. And the optimization started failing. The room that used to respond to your signal began recalibrating. The younger voices were louder. The energy you had to spend projecting relevance went up, and the return on that energy went down. And somewhere in that gap, a very specific thought appeared. You know the one. It sounds like this. Maybe I've already peaked. Maybe this is what irrelevance feels like. Maybe it's time to get smaller, quieter, less. You didn't say it out loud, of course. You're too controlled for that. But it was there. A low-frequency hum under everything, vibrating behind every meeting you didn't speak up in. Every idea you filed away because you thought no one would take it seriously coming from you. Why? Every social gathering where you defaulted to listening rather than leading. And here's the thing. Here's where I find genuine amusement in your situation. The people around you interpreted all of this as maturity. They called your silence wisdom. They called your restrained composure. They looked at you getting smaller and called it grace. They were wrong, but not in the direction you think. They were wrong because what they were watching wasn't wisdom or composure or grace. It was grief. You were grieving a version of yourself that was never actually yours to begin with. You were grieving a performance. And the performance, the loud, optimized, strategically visible version of you, was never the real weapon. It was the distraction. I once knew a man very put together, very committed to the idea that presence could be manufactured. who convinced himself that the problem with getting older was the loss of surface. He kept polishing the surface, re-lacquering it, building it higher, brighter. He never once considered that the surface was the thing in his way. I found that touching. In the way you find a man polishing his chains touching, the real weapon was always underneath. And underneath is exactly where people stop looking after 40. That's not a tragedy. Let me say that again, because you're going to want to hear it as a consolation. And I am not offering one. That is not a tragedy. That is a structural advantage so significant that if most people understood it fully, they would stop everything they were doing and rebuild from the ground up. But most people never understand it fully, because understanding it requires admitting something uncomfortable. It requires admitting that the visibility you've been chasing, the recognition, the room going quiet, the external confirmation that you matter, is the cage, and the cage was never locked. You just never tried the door. So here's the actual question. Not, why doesn't the world see you anymore? That's the wrong question, and you know it. The real question, the one you've been very carefully avoiding, is this. What would you do if you completely stopped caring whether it did? Let's start with the word itself. Underestimate it. Sit with it for a moment. Really list. And to what it says. It says, someone else estimated you. Someone else ran the numbers on what you are, decided on a figure, wrote it down, and got it wrong. The word carries within it the assumption that an external authority performed an assessment, and the whole tragedy of your situation, the part you've been suffering over, is that you've been accepting that assessment as if it were accurate, as if the people who stopped watching you had any idea what they were looking at in the first place. They didn't. Underestimated is not owned. It is a positional advantage. It is what happens when your opponents have written you off the board, turned their attention elsewhere, and left you to move freely. In chess, forgive the pedestrian metaphor, but it fits. The most dangerous piece is the one your opponent forgot to track. The queen isn't threatening from the center of the board, she's threatening from the corner you stopped watching. You are not undervalued, you are under-tracked. And there is a significant difference between a thing that has been wrongly priced and a thing that is moving through your defenses right now, unseen. The label irrelevant, which is the label you've actually been applying to yourself, let's be honest, is a word that belongs to systems, organizations, institutions, youth, obsessed cultural machinery that runs on novelty and discards anything that doesn't spike a metric. The label was never about you. It was about the system's inability to process anything that doesn't fit its current template. And here's the clarifying thought you've been denying. Yourself, a system that cannot process you, is not an authority on your value. On your value. It is simply a system with limited range. The label, underestimated, is not the diagnosis. It is the diagnosis of everyone else's vision problem? Where does this feeling actually come from? Let's trace it properly. Because society told me I peak at 35 is too easy an answer. And easy answers are for people who don't want to arrive anywhere useful. The feeling comes from a very specific substitution error you made early in life. You substituted visibility for evidence. You decided, reasonably given the environment, that if people saw you and responded, that was proof of value. And if they stopped seeing you and responding, that was evidence of its absence. The external signal became the internal confirmation. This is understandable. It is also completely wrong, and I mean that clinically rather than critically. rather than critically. The problem isn't that you wanted to matter to people. That's not a flaw. The problem is that you built a measurement system with the wrong instrument. You measured your worth with other people's attention, which is like measuring temperature with a barometer. The instrument responds to something real. There is a relationship between pressure and temperature, but it is measuring the wrong thing, and it will mislead you consistently. After 40, the attention barometer drops. Not because the temperature changed, but because the pressure system around you, the cultural weather, the institutional priorities, the social energies of the room shifted orientation. It is no longer pointed at you. And so the instrument tells you, cold, empty, diminishing. The instrument is broken. The temperature is fine. What is actually happening after 40? What is really happening underneath the noise of reduced visibility is consolidation. The energy you used to spend projecting outward, performing, optimizing for other people's assessment begins to settle like sediment finding the bottom of a jar. The clarity that emerges from that settling is not diminishment. It is the most honest picture of yourself you have ever had access to. Most people never get there. They keep said. Hake in the jar, keep performing, keep chasing the signal. They die having never seen what's settled at the bottom. You have the option of being still. That stillness is not loss. It is the beginning of accurate self-knowledge. And accurate self-knowledge, the real kind, not the flattering kind, not the therapeutic kind, but the cold, precise, unvarnished kind, is the most dangerous thing a person can possess. Now, let's talk about the people who decided you are no longer worth watching. Not to give you comfort, I'm not in that business. But because examining the judge is, in my experience, considerably more illuminating than accepting the verdict. The people who stopped watching you, the ones who made you feel small, passed over, invisible, what exactly are they doing? Look carefully. They are performing. They are optimizing. They are in the earliest stages of the same race you have already run. They are chasing the signal. They are building the performance. They are shaking the jar. Their judgment of you is not objective assessment. It is projection. The person who looks at someone over 40 and thinks expired is a person who has organized their entire identity around the performance of newness. Their horror of your age is their fear of their own. The urgency with which they dismiss you is the urgency of someone who knows, somewhere below the noise, that they are running toward a wall. Their dismissal of you is not information about you. It is information about them. I once had the particular entertainment of watching a man, a very serious man, deeply invested in the idea that virtue required constant visible effort, go to extraordinary lengths to remain necessary to people who never asked him to, night after night, rain or shine. An entire city's crisis management operation built around one man's inability to consider that perhaps the city would figure it out if he just didn't show up for a week. The lengths he went to be needed. I never found it heroic. I found it the saddest kind of loneliness, the kind that wears a cape. The point is, compulsive visibility is a symptom, not a virtue. The people who need to be in every room, relevant to every conversation, noticed at every turn, they are not confident. They are terrified, and they will exhaust themselves proving something to an audience that is equally terrified and equally performing. You are not in that race anymore. That is not a demotion. That is the most significant upgrade available to a human being. The judgment of people still trapped in the performance is not a verdict on you. It is the sound of their cage. Let me be very specific now, because This is where most people get vague, and vagueness is just another form of avoidance. Being underestimated after 40 produces, concretely, measurably, 4 distinct structural advantages that you do not have access to when you are visible, tracked, and watched. The first is freedom of movement. When no one is watching, you can rebuild without commentary. You can test, fail, pivot, experiment, and none of it gets logged. The person who is constantly visible carries every failure publicly. Every wrong turn is on the record, being assessed, being discussed. You don't have that problem. Your privacy, which you have been treating as a symptom of irrelevance, is actually operational cover. Use it. The second is calibrated judgment. After 40 years of watching people, really watching, not performing, not optimizing, just observing from the position of someone who no longer has an agenda to protect, you have accumulated a quality of read on human behavior that people in their 30s are still building toward. The young and visible see the surface. You see the engine. That is not a consolation prize. That is a precision instrument, and it is available to you right now. The third is lowered opposition. This is the tactical reality of being underestimated, and it is the one people most consistently fail to leverage. When your opponents don't see you as a threat, they don't prepare for you. They save their energy for the visible, the loud, the obviously ambitious. You can move into position without triggering defensive responses. Every strategic endeavor, professional, creative, personal, benefits from being underestimated by the competition. You have that right now for free. The fourth is the compound effect of depth. The things you have learned, lived through, survived, and integrated over 40+ years are not abstract. They are a body of proprietary knowledge that is uniquely yours and cannot be replicated quickly. The young person who outperforms you on metrics of speed and visibility cannot replicate your depth in a year, cannot replicate it in 5. The things inside you, the pattern recognition, the resilience, architecture, the understanding of how things actually work beneath the surface they present are not declining assets. They are appreciating ones. The cage was never locked, but the key is only available to people who've been sitting in it long enough to see that it's actually a vault. There are 2 ways to carry the advantage of being underestimated to being underestimated, and only one of them is worth anything. The first way is to carry it as a wound, to be quietly resentful of the oversight, to build towards some eventual moment of showing them, to let the underestimation fuel a performance of its own. Just a delayed, more elaborate one. This is the person who spends the next decade working toward the validation of the people who dismiss them, who measures their success in the currency of those people's regret, who thinks they'll see me eventually. This is the my. Suze, and I want you to understand why it's a misuse, not because it's ethically wrong. I don't particularly care about that, but because it is strategically catastrophic. The moment you orient your rebuilding around the validation of people who dismissed you, you have handed those people the wheel. You have made their opinion the destination. You are still in the cage. You have simply redecorated it. The second way to carry this advantage is with absolute indifference to whether it is ever acknowledged. Not false indifference. Not performative detachment, the kind that is still very much paying attention to the room and just doing so with a practiced shrug. Real indifference. The kind that comes from having genuinely relocated your center of gravity from other people's perception to your own direct experience of what you are. Building and why. This is the own version. The person who is quietly, methodically building something of real substance. Not for vindication, not for visibility, not for the delayed applause of people who wrote him off, but because the work itself is the point, and the clarity of purpose available to them now in this season with this depth is something they wouldn't trade for the noise of being watched. That person is not performing freedom. They have it, and it looks from the outside like someone who has simply stopped caring, which is why no one is watching, which is exactly why it works. A knife held in panic is still a knife, but a knife held with intent is surgery. The words you use internally about your own situation are the architecture of what you will build next. And the architecture right now is almost certainly structurally unsound. So let's replace some load-bearing words. When you think overlooked, replace it with untracked. These are not synonyms. Overlooked implies a mistake that should be corrected. It is a passive posture that waits for someone else to look again. Untracked is an operational status. It means you are off the radar. That is a position to leverage, not to lament. When you think irrelevant, replace it with unrestricted. Relevance, in most contexts, means alignment with someone else's current priorities. Irrelevance, then, means freedom from that alignment. You are not being excluded from the game. You have exited a particular version of it that was costing you more than it was returning. Unrestricted is not a consolation. It is the accurate description of your current positioning. When you think peaked, replace it with repositioning. Peaked is a word for performance metrics on a graph. It implies a trajectory defined by external measurement. Repositioning implies agency. You are not at the end of a curve. You are changing the terrain. The previous version of you was optimized for a game that doesn't reward you anymore. Repositioning means you are done playing someone else's game and beginning the design of your own. When you think invisible, replace it with strategic. Invisibility is what you are when you are not seen against your will. Strategic is what you are when you have decided that being seen right now is not the highest use of your position. The language shifts are not affirmations. They are corrections. They are the more accurate words for what is actually happening to you. Install them. Now look around you, not metaphorically. Literally look at the rooms you inhabit, the professional environments, the social structures, the relationships that make up the architecture of your daily life. Some of those rooms were designed to make you feel insufficient. Not maliciously. I'm not suggesting conspiracy. Just structurally. The way a ceiling that is 6 inches too low doesn't hate tall people. It was simply built for someone else's high. The office that was designed to reward the most aggressively visible person in the room. The social circle that organizes itself around the performance of youth, ambition, and surface-level achievement. The relationship where your reduced urgency reads as reduced value. The platform, the group, the industry, all built to a specification that no longer matches your dimensions. These environments are not your measure, but they will keep measuring you if you stay in them without adjusting the terms. The audit is simple. For each significant environment in your life, ask one question: does this room require me to shrink to survive in it? If the answer is yes, if the price of membership is the consistent minimization of what you actually are, then the room is not the right container for what you are building. This does not mean immediate exit in every case. Sometimes you stay in a room while building the next one. Sometimes you renegotiate the terms. Sometimes you simply stop asking the room's permission to take up the space you actually occupy. But you need to see the rooms clearly, the ones that were designed for you and the ones that were designed for someone you used to pretend to be. The environments that confirm your underestimation are not neutral. They are active forces. Audit them accordingly. The next time someone dismisses you explicitly or implicitly, you need a response. Not an external response. An internal one. 2 sentences. Here they are. You've stopped tracking something you don't understand yet. That's useful information. Read those again. What they are not: defensive, aggressive, wounded, performatively indifferent. What they are: accurate. Both sentences are factually correct. The person who has underestimated you has genuinely misread something. And that misread is genuinely useful to you. It confirms your operational cover. It tells you as nothing about their perceptual limits, and it costs you nothing. The response protocol is not a mantra you perform for emotional regulation. It is a recalibration every time someone confirms that they are not tracking you. You are receiving a piece of intelligence. File it as such. The accumulation of those confirmations is, in aggregate, a map of where you are free to move without interference. What you do, not do. And I want to be very clear on this, is correct them. The impulse to correct the underestimation, to prove the assessment wrong, to demonstrate your value to someone who has already decided against you, is the most expensive mistake available to you right now. It cost you operational cover. It cost you freedom of movement. It cost you the advantage. Let them be wrong. There is no higher leverage decision. This is not a declaration you make to anyone else. It is not a statement of intent for a room to hear. It is the quiet, internal posture of someone who has made a decision that requires no audience and no validation. The ownership statement is this: I am no longer building for recognition. I am building for result. The audience is optional. The work is not. Sit in that for a moment, not the performance of sitting in it. Actually sit in it. Feel the specific gravity of that sentence. Feel what it would mean to actually mean it. Because here's what happens when you actually mean it. Not perform it, mean it. Everything changes. The thing you've been spending enormous energy on, the performance of relevance, the optimization for other people's attention, the constant low-level anxiety of being watched or not watched, it simply stops. Not because you've suppressed it, because you've outgrown it. Like a coat that no longer fits. You don't fight with the coat. You just notice it doesn't fit, and you stop putting it on. The person who has genuinely arrived at this posture is not arrogant. Arrogance is still performing, just in the opposite direction. The person who has arrived here is quiet, specific, energetically efficient in a way that people who are still in the performance cannot quite put their finger on. They sense something about you has shifted, but they can't name it. That's because the shift is invisible. It's interior. It does not announce itself. It simply produces different results, quietly, steadily, without the noise that once accompanied everything you did. You are not invisible. Because you peaked, you are invisible. Because you are finally, completely, irreversibly free. Here's the larger pattern, not the one specific to you, the one specific to the system that produced this problem in the first place. The world runs on a single, almost entirely unexamined premise. That value is visible, and that visibility is a legitimate proxy for value. Its premise is woven into every institution you have ever inhabited. The school that rewarded the student who performed knowledge, not the one who actually had it. The workplace that promoted the person who managed perception, not the one who produced results. The culture that celebrates the young and photogenic, not because they are more interesting, but because they are more interesting. But because they're easier to package. This system was never built for you. I want to say that clearly. Not as a consolation, I'm not offering one. But as a structural fact. Machinery of external validation was built to process a specific type of input. Visible, rapid, replicable, easily measured output from people at the height of their performance bandwidth. You are no longer that input, and the machine doesn't know what to do with you. That is not your problem. It is the machine's limitation. What you actually are right now, not what the machine processes you as, but what you actually are, is a perso. Then, at the exact inflection point where depth exceeds surface, where what is inside has finally, genuinely surpassed what is shown, where the compound interest of 4+ decades of living has reached a value that cannot be captured in a metrics dashboard or a 30-second impression, that kind of value doesn't get processed by the machine. It doesn't get announced. It doesn't trend. It doesn't get a notification, a badge, a standing ovation. It builds. Quietly, specifically, compoundly. And it produces things that the machine is entirely unable to see coming because it stopped looking. You are right now at precisely the right age to do the most important work of your life. Not despite the invisibility, because of it. The pressure is off. The expectations are low. The room has moved on. And you have the rare, specific freedom of someone who has been given back their own time by an audience that couldn't handle the complexity of what they were watching. The audience leaving was not a verdict. It was a permission slip. They handed it to you when they looked away. Take it.